Hello guys, welcome to another video. Now I've been playing a bit of PoE2 and more than anything I've just been doing a lot of re-rolling into new characters and doing lots of respecking to test a bunch of new stuff out. And after many re-rolls I've landed on a pretty cool build which has a bunch of fun interactions. And in this video I'm going to be going over all of it. But part of the credit for this concept has to go to ThatsRealNeato, who made a video 3 days ago or so about his Armour Explosion build. At the time, he was using Shield Wall to create a wall, and then you can break the armor of each segment of that wall to cause an Armour Explosion support to come off of each segment. So it's quite a lot of overlap damage in that small area. And I thought that this was a really cool concept, but the problem with Shield Wall is that it's limited to a single wall baseline. So when you summon a new one, the old one gets despawned. You can get additional walls from the quality stat on the gem, but any slam skills that you use on the wall will immediately destroy the wall as well, which is actually a bad thing. We'll get into that in just a moment. So I started to think a little bit about this, and I did a bunch of testing on another character, and I found out that Ice Wall also works in the same way. You can break the armor of each Ice Wall segment to cause an explosion from each one using Armour Explosion support. Then I remembered that there's a crossbow attack that creates ice walls at the end of the bolt trajectory. And I checked to see if Armour Explosion support is limited to melee, and it's not. So I did a bit more testing, and with that, the build concept was pretty much set in stone, and I re-rolled again into a new character. So let's take a look at how the build works first of all, and talk about some of the interactions, and then I'll discuss the good and bad points for the setup that I have going at the moment, and I'll close out with some gameplay so you can see how it plays in maps and against bosses. So here's my character. I'm currently level 68. I've only just reached mapping on this character, and this is a Warbringer. So let's just go over, first of all, the basic concepts of the build. So we've got Glacial Bolt, here it is, and it's linked to Armour Explosion. So Armour Explosion is to support whenever you fully break a target's armour, it will create an explosion around the attack that it's supporting, right? So if you hit a target with that attack, it will then create an explosion if that attack fully breaks the armor of the target. So this is linked to Glacial Bolt. And what this skill does is it fires one bolt by default, and that bolt will then create ice walls at the end of its trajectory. Let's just remove some of these gems real quick so I can just show you what the skill looks like normally. So this makes 2 ice walls in like a V shape. And you can actually see each segment of the wall. So this is one segment here, this is another segment. I believe there's 5 segments in each wall, and that's important because that's where the armor explosions come from. So if we place this back in, I can show you the basic setup for the build. So you fire one glacial wall, and then the next bolt will explode it. Now, one thing you may notice, you might be able to see it or you may not be able to see it, but whenever an attack hits the wall, it's only ever exploding the new wall that's being created. So the armor explosion can only happen once on each target because it's that attack which causes the armor to be broken, and then after that, the wall is already has broken armor, right? We'll get to why that's important in just a moment, but first, we have Scatter Shot. So Scatter Shot will make Glacial Bolt fire 2 projectiles instead of 1, so it will shoot two bolts out. 2 extra bolts, I should say. So it's 3 bolts in total. So you can see that you just get, basically you get more wall, and then that creates more overlaps. The really cool thing about this support is that supported skills deal 20% less damage, but this only supports projectile skills. So the only part that it makes it deal less damage is the Glacial Bolt and the wall that's produced by the Glacial Bolt, and so the Armour Explosion isn't factored in here, so this doesn't receive the 20% less damage component of that support. So that's a nice added bonus there. And then we have Primal Armament, which is just 25% more weapon elemental damage. We deal only elemental damage in this build, and I'll go over that in just a moment, but essentially Armour Explosion converts 100% of physical to fire for the Armour Explosion portion of the skill, and then Glacial Bolt, we actually don't have any projectile scaling at all in this build. We only have area of effects and area attack damage scaling, And the only part that benefits from that is the actual wall itself. And the wall converts 100% of physical into cold. So basically, no matter which part of the attack we're doing, whether it's the creation of the wall and then the wall being on the ground, or the armor explosions that are coming off of each segment of wall, all of our physical damage is being converted to elemental. The reason why we're a Warbringer is because of this node here, Anvil's Weight. Break armor equal to 10% of hit damage dealt. So this, as far as I'm aware, the only other way to break armor without physical damage is with a support gem. I can't remember what it's called right now, but it breaks armor whenever you heavy stun a target. So other than that, most armor break things in the game are to do with physical damage. For example, the Splinter support, which makes a portion of your physical hit damage break armor. This is the only other way that you can use to break armor with non-physical damage, and that's, as I said, really important because we're only dealing elemental damage. This is the crucial part of this build. Without this node, it doesn't work. Okay, so that's the main setup. That's kind of how the build works. We've got some other stuff going on here. So earlier I was discussing about how, you know, the shield wall being immediately destroyed by a slam is a bad thing because we want the walls to stay there. And the reason for that is actually because there is a way to remove broken armor from a target. And obviously there's actually a lot of skills that do this, you know, consuming broken armor. But the thing is, because the wall has a certain amount of life, it's very hard to do that without breaking the wall with your own damage, right? Because you just have a ton of damage. And most of the time, if you watch, we are basically breaking our own walls. You can see them being smashed. But sometimes some of them stay up. You can see some of them do occasionally stay alive. And that's actually really important because the more walls that are up at any one time and surrounding, you know, a boss, the more damage we can deal. And the way we're able to remove armor so that the walls can then be exploded a second time or even a third time is with our cast on freeze setup. So cast on freeze, this skill basically does exactly what it says. Whenever you freeze a target, it builds up energy and then it uses the spells automatically, which is nice because we don't want to have to manually cast these. So we've got Frost Wall in there for some, you know, some extra walls being spawned, which just means more armor explosions essentially. And the more important part of this setup is Solar Orb and Exploit Weakness. So Solar Orb is a long duration spell. It lasts for 10 seconds. You can only have one orb, but that's fine. We just want this kind of AoE effect that goes on top of all of our walls. And this pulses every 1.4 seconds. It deals a hit of fire damage. So Exploit Weakness is a support which supported skills consume enemy fully broken armor to deal 50% more damage. So this skill is basically dealing almost no damage because we have no spell scaling, we have, you know, no scaling at all for this support other than this 50% more damage, and it's a low level gem as well. So we don't care about how much damage this is dealing, we just need it to deal a tiny bit of damage so they can consume the fully broken armor of any ice walls that are left standing, which means that we can then hit them with the next Glacial Bolt that we use. Because one of the really important things about this build is that the Glacial Bolt, you'll notice that we're only firing, you know, one bolt comes out, and it's only going in one line into the front of this V shape, right? But you'll notice that all of the wall is being exploded, not just the front part. So what's happening there? Well, Glacial Bolt and the ice walls all count as part of the attack. So it's not just the bolt that comes out, it's also the ice wall itself. That part is an attack. So when this V shape gets spawned, like this, on top of a previous ice wall, it's also hitting that ice wall with the attack, and all of those previous walls are then exploding. And there's something else that's really important to say about that as well. Because the ice wall is part of an attack, whenever enemies walk into this, they're taking attack damage based on our crossbow. Because you can see right here, if you look into the wall, the attack damage of the wall is 116%. And it converts 100% of our physical damage to cold. So whenever a monster tries to walk through this wall, they start to take attack damage. And if their armor breaks while they're walking through this wall, they also explode. And when that happens, it kind of creates a chain explosion around them because, you know, it hits all of the walls, and there's like this cool chain explosion thing that happens, and you'll probably be able to see that in some of the footage. So that's the kind of main two components with the build. But there's some other stuff we've got going on because we're a Warbringer, and Warbringer doesn't really do very well with a ranged playstyle. There isn't really much on the Ascendancy for this. So let's just go over the Ascendancy quickly. So as I said, Anvil's weight is really important. But the next node, which is you can break enemy armor to below 0, is completely useless for this build. Because we're doing fully elemental damage. We're fully focused in on dealing elemental damage. Which means that, you know, this doesn't really do anything for us. Armor only protects against physical damage. And therefore, whether the target's actually broken armor or negative armor doesn't matter for our damage output. So this node here wouldn't do anything for us. At the same time, there's some block nodes here. We're not using a shield. I mean, we have got a shield on the shield swap, but it's not particularly useful for the majority of the time where we're using a crossbow. And then down here, there's some Warcry nodes, which could be useful in the future for a build like this if there's some other fun Warcries coming into the game, but the ones that are in the game right now only work for melee attacks, and the other things that they do is not, you know, not that useful for Ascendancy nodes on this build. So the only other thing that's left really is this wheel here, which is the Totem branch, and this one here. So Jade Heritage, this is something that I plan to pick up on this build in the final Ascension. But I've grabbed Answered Call here, and what this node does is it spawns an Ancestral Spirit whenever you summon a totem. And I actually did a lot of testing with these spirits at launch. A couple of days after launch, I actually made an entire build around these spirits with, you know, like minion instability and stuff, which ended up being really bad. But it kind of got me a lot of information about what these spirits do. So whenever you summon a totem, you spawn a random spirit. This one here, it kind of does a leap slam and does a charge. This one is the most useless of the 4 different spirits. It doesn't really do anything for us because we're not scaling minion damage, so these minions do very low amount of damage. But whenever you summon these, it summons a random one. Now this is the important one, this Warhorn minion. It grants us a buff, Warcaller's Bellow. You gain 5 rage on hit with attacks and have 10% increased skill speed. Now the really important thing about that buff is that it's one of the only ways in the game right now in PoE 2 to get rage on a ranged attack build. There's only melee rage in the game. I think the only other way that you can get rage on ranged builds is from some of the nodes on the tree, which make it so you generate rage when you get hit. And there's one, I think, that generates rage when you use a Warcry. And there's also a Font of Rage support, which allows you to regenerate a small amount of rage over time when you're standing next to a totem. But watch what happens when I get this buff. I start hitting the Glacial Wall. You can see I'm immediately generating a ton of rage. And that's because all of these portions of wall are counted as enemies for the purpose of my skills. Because I can deal damage to them, and I can hit them, and that means I generate rage. So it's a really easy way for me to generate 30 rage immediately, and it's really strong for bossing. There's a couple other minions that these totems spawn. This one right here, it won't do anything right now, but when you're near enemies, it basically encases enemies in Jade. It's like another CC. That's really strong. And there is one more, which is... Let's see if I can get it to spawn. It's a turtle. There it is. So the turtle has this ring. You can see the ring around it. You have 50% increased defenses and 25% increased chance to block. Obviously, the block chance is not very useful there, but the increased defenses is really nice. That's just 50% increased global defenses. So that's one of the other cool things we've got going on. And one of the last things is the totem itself. So we're using Ripwire, which is even more CC. This one fires bolts which build up pin on enemies, and it also maims them, so they're even slower. We've got Overabundance, so we can summon multiple totems. Ancestral Urgency, so they summon really quickly. And lastly, Font of Blood for some regen. I've actually prioritized regen a lot in this build because I think it's a really valuable stat. And so you can see I've got about 80 health regen normally, like, you know, when I'm just not near any buffs. And then when I'm actually standing on top of the totem, about 130 life regen. As I'm also using Herald of Ash with Vitality there as well. Also got my passive tree here. I thought I'd just showcase what I'm doing on the passive tree. So passive tree setup is a little bit weird because obviously, like I said, we're a Warbringer. We start here, so we kind of need to path over here to get some good stuff in the range area. And there's also some good stuff up here towards, you know, sort of the strength in area. So we're mainly focusing on area scaling and area damage. We also picked up some regen here at the start, which is really nice. But yeah, we've got some, you know, area effect here, area attack damage, more of that stuff here, and here's some resistance and max res. And this node here is really strong because we're dealing all 3 elements. We're dealing cold damage mostly with the frost wall is all fizz converted to cold. We've got a little bit of flat added cold, but it's mostly from the fizz conversion. And then we've got lightning on our crossbow. And we've also got the fire, of course, coming from some flat there, but mostly from the conversion on the armor explosion support. So I've got these 3 nodes here, and each of these nodes grant 30% increased damage of hits when the target is ignited, chilled, and shocked. And that's going to be most of the time. Whenever we're focusing on a target, they're going to have these 3 ailments on them most of the time. Because we hit very, very often and we hit quite hard. So all of these hits are going to be quite often causing those ailments. So that's a really nice wheel here for this build. And then moving down towards here, we've got more kind of attack, area of effect, and damage. And then moving down here, we've got a little bit of this crossbow wheel here. This one is a 15% chance for crossbow attacks to not consume a bolt. One of the things about Glacial Bolt is that by default, it only loads 1 bolt per reload. So we're currently using this crossbow, which allows us to load an additional bolt. And occasionally, we'll proc this to, you know, get 3 or even 4 attacks before we actually reload, which is really nice. If we get really lucky there, you know, we might be able to proc this on both of those bolts, which is very nice. And then we've got this node here for a bit of attack damage penetration for all 3 elements. That's really nice. And also, this one here is really good for improving the speed at which we inflict those ailments. So it's increased chance to ignite, increased freeze build-up, and increased shock chance there as well. And further up here, we've got Elemental Equilibrium, which is a great keystone for this build, because we're dealing all 3 elements all the time with all of our hits. It means that every single time we hit, we're removing the exposure for all 3 types, and then immediately reapplying that exposure. So the next hit benefits from the exposure, then it instantly strips them off and puts them back on again. So it's just constantly stripping exposure and putting it back on, and then benefiting on the next attack. We're also passing through Catalysis, which I think is probably the best elemental attack node in the game, with the 5% of physical damage from hits taken as the damage of a random element, because I'm actually using Cloak of Flame, which I dropped in SSF, which is awesome. So, because this build I've not been able to scale much armor, because this is kind of the parting that I've done means that I can't scale too much armor. There's some stuff here which I could get, but I'm then on the way to this node right here, Harness the Elements, which is 15% increased damage for each type of elemental ailment on the enemy, which is going to be 3 ailments most of the time, chill, shock, and ignite, and occasionally it's going to be 4 with freeze as well. So that's the basic setup for the passive tree, and I'm not really too sure what I'm going to do, you know, further into the end game, but that's what's going on. This build kind of struggles a bit for mapping. It's one of the really big downsides of the build, which is something that I hadn't really thought about when I kind of put the build together. I really didn't think this was going to be a problem, because I thought the area of effects would be really good. But actually, the area of effects is one of the biggest issues with the build. You kind of really struggle for clearing, and you get lots of stragglers and things. The build is really good at bossing. I mean, even with the weapon that I've got now, I should have some footage going up later in this video, or maybe it's up now. For bossing, this build is really good. You basically just cover the boss in ice walls. They're constantly getting frozen and stunned, and, you know, they're always chilled. And also, anytime they use, like, projectile abilities, your walls just block everything. So projectile abilities are no longer dangerous. So it's really, really strong for bossing. Does a lot of damage as well, considering how bad my crossbow is. The amount of damage that I'm able to deal is pretty good. So, yeah. That's basically the overview of the build, and it's a really fun build. I think it's a cool concept. I've actually got a bunch of... I'm kind of really enjoying this early phase of PoE 2, because instead I thought I would be someone who would just, like, you know, immediately go into one build and just progress deep into endgame. But I've actually been really interested in just, like, checking out a bunch of different mechanics and, you know, testing out new things. So that's basically what I've been doing. I've been doing so much re-rolling, and you know, I've basically, my first character, I fully respec'd the character like 3 times, I think. So I literally farmed gold just to respec it 3 times to just test out a bunch of stuff. So that's pretty much what I've been doing. And yeah, this build, I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out so far. I'm going to continue playing it, but I may re-roll onto another build before long because I've got some other ideas that I want to test out. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this. I'll leave some footage up of, you know, mapping and bossing and stuff like that. But thanks for watching this video. And as always, stay tuned and stay safe.
You think you can run? Nothing will stand in my way! Fatal ambition! This is not over yet.